lost to history, labored over a small coffin that morning. No ordinary casket. This box was to hold remains more symbolic than real. Its burden not the body of a single man, but a smattering of the ashes of 200 or more. It was just 9 days short of a year since they had died, their battered corpses immolated in one huge funeral pyre and 2 smaller ones. In the intervening 12 months, the piles of ashes and charred bones just sat out in the open, blown by the prairie winds, picked over by foraging rodents, scattered by the passage of men and animals. The men those ashes once had been became truly a part of the soil they had died for. Still, more remained than the small casket could hold, and so only ashes from the 2 smaller piles went into the box. On the inside of its lid the carpenter carved 3 names: Travis, Bowie, Crockett, 3 to stand for them all, and now to rest forever together in this casket, united in eternity as they had been united in their deaths. And yet it is all illusion. On the one hand, fiction became fact, and on the other, misconception turned into history. Not one of them, not Crockett or Bowie or Travis, or Austin for that matter, attended the Jackson dinner. There were no speeches of Texas and dying for liberty. The whole story is an invention. As for their burial together 9 years later, it is quite possible, even probable, that not an atom of the one-time bodies of any of the 3 found its way into the coffin that bore their names. They would become accustomed to not being where posterity supposed them to be. Near Morristown, Tennessee, there stands a Crockett Tavern, a 20th-century building in which he never set foot, that may or may not have been on the actual site of his boyhood home. In Opelousas, Louisiana, visitors tour the Jim Bowie House, a building he never owned or lived in, and that has nothing whatever to do with him. At Purdue Hill, Alabama, restoration continues on the William Barret Travis house, for which not a scrap of evidence exists to establish it as his one-time home. No one is trying to fool anyone here. The Travis house sponsors admit that only local tradition associates him with the cottage. Opelousas forthrightly declares that the Bowie house is merely named after a famous former resident. The Crockett Tavern managers openly confess that their reconstruction and siting are conjectural. Certainly all 3 dwellings represent what these men could have lived in at some moment in their lives. And that in itself is significant, for in the 80 years since their deaths, their stories have been usurped by what they might have done, where they could have been, and even how they might have died. Such a vacuum of information dominates the major portions of their histories that supposition, fabrication, and myth have filled the empty spaces, and are so oft repeated that falsehood and legend stand side by side with fact in the canon of their biographies. The single instance of that famous January 1828 dinner in New Orleans shows how far from the truth their admirers have strayed. Demonstrably, Crockett was at that moment 1,000 miles to the east in Washington. Travis was an unknown 18-year-old student in rural Alabama who would hardly be invited to share a dais with anyone, let alone the next president. And Bowie, though the only one who might have been in New Orleans at the time, was by all associations opposed to Jackson. Whereas the story says that he was invited to speak in honor of his prominent role in the 1815 Battle of New Orleans, in fact he was nowhere near the battle and saw no action at all in the War of 1812. This first meeting of the 3 whose names would be forever linked by their deaths at the Alamo simply never happened. Ignorance has been the curse of their posterity, and it still flourishes. Even while this book was being written, Senator J. Strom Thurmond of South Carolina boasted of his fellow Carolinian Travis as the man who commanded the Alamo, with 3,000 Russians threatening to attack.